What makes you, you, and how do any of us actually define ourselves? Now that may sound like I've just lost my mind, and I probably did a long time ago, but bear with me for just a second here because it is an important and interesting problem. Recently, I was discussing this exact question with some of my viewers on Discord. What is it exactly that made them Dutch, or German, or Polish? And the usual answers came up pretty quickly. We define ourselves in relation to the language that we speak. There are values that we share, perhaps a history, a faith, and religion too. There are positive things that bind us together as people. But I then put forward a more controversial argument about identity, and one which I would like to elaborate on today. You see, there is another way identity forms within us humans. And it's not by what unites us, but by what we reject, by who we are not. Every person, every community lives between these two opposing forces. There is unity on one hand and negation on the other. And when that balance breaks, when what divides us becomes stronger than what unites us, that's where politics really begins. This balance between unity and opposition is not just a personal struggle. It's the story of entire nations, and there's no better example than Austria-Hungary, the empire I keep coming back to on this channel. Because identity was its central question, and nowhere is that clearer than in 1914, at the start of the First World War, where Europe reached a kind of breaking point, a symbolic impasse between positive and negative identity. Austria-Hungary, on the one hand, had governed 50 million people across a dozen nationalities for over 600 years. It had vast territories, sophisticated institutions, and a professional bureaucracy. It tried to build unity through prosperity and administration, through making belonging rational and profitable for everyone. Serbia, on the other hand, was a peasant kingdom that had only existed as an independent state for 36 years. It was poor, politically unstable, and barely recognized by the great powers. But it did know exactly what it was because it knew what it opposed. And somehow, the smaller Serbian kingdom would outlast the Austro-Hungarian Empire that dwarfed it. It wasn't through military success. Now, it's true that Serbia's armies won stunning victories in 1914, but they would then be crushed in 1915 and forced to retreat. There is something deeper here, and it has to do with the way that political identity actually works. And that's what I want to explore today, through the lens of a very controversial German philosopher. Let me tell you a story about how Austria-Hungary tried to build a relationship with Serbia. In 1882, just a few years after gaining full international recognition of its independence from the Ottoman Empire, Serbia declared itself a kingdom. And Vienna saw an opportunity, not through conquest, but through influence. The Habsburgs would back King Milan Obrenović, hoping to turn Serbia into a loyal ally, a state under their economic and political umbrella. Serbia would get to keep its monarchy, its church, and its flag, but in practice it would now orbit within Vienna's sphere of influence. And Serbia accepted this offer. For the next 2 decades, this relationship actually worked. By the early 1900s, 84% of Serbian exports flowed to Austria-Hungary. Serbian agricultural products fed Habsburg cities, while capital from Vienna funded development in Belgrade. It was the empire's way of building an elaborate economic dependency, a web of mutual interests that was supposed to transform Serbia from a potential threat into a loyal partner. And this was how Austria-Hungary approached most problems, not through the use of force, but through integration, through making it economically rational to belong to the Austro-Hungarian sphere. The empire's goal was not to try to make Serbs into Germans or Hungarians, but it was to try and make being part of the Habsburg system more profitable than being outside of it. Austria-Hungary treated politics as a problem of administration. The empire's instinct wasn't to ask its subjects to unite around a shared identity, because that would mean choosing between competing national claims. Instead, it focused on what it could actually control: infrastructure, trade networks, and institutional advancement. If you could make the system work by creating enough economic and social interdependence, then perhaps the question of who are we wouldn't need an answer and would instead dissolve. And for a very long time, this worked really well. It was integration through self-interest. But there was a critical flaw in this plan, and something the empire didn't really come to understand. And that's that some questions can't be solved economically. Some conflicts just aren't about self-interest or what's profitable or most efficient. They're about identity, about a people's vision of their own future and their place in history. And there is one decision that Austria-Hungary made which revealed this blind spot catastrophically. Bosnia-Herzegovina had been under Habsburg administration since 1878. The empire formally annexed it in 1908. From Vienna's perspective, this made perfect administrative sense. The territory, after all, was already managed by Habsburg officials, so formal annexation just clarified the legal situation and prevented other powers, particularly Russia, from making claims on it. But Serbia saw something entirely different. To understand why, you need to know what Serbia wanted. Serbian nationalists envisioned a greater Serbia. It was a state that would theoretically unite all Southern Slavs under Serbian leadership. South Slavs encompassed Serbs, but also included Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Macedonians, and other peoples who shared similar languages and cultures but were scattered across different territories, many of them under Habsburg rule. It goes without saying that Bosnia-Herzegovina was crucial to this vision. It contained large Serbian populations, yes, but more importantly, it also offered a path to the Adriatic coast, access to the sea that would make a southern Slavic state geographically viable and economically independent. When Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia in 1908, it was perceived by Serbia as blocking the potential for a geographic completion of a southern Slavic state. The annexation told Serbian nationalists that their vision of uniting their people would never be able to happen while the Habsburg system stood above them. As such, Serbia's relationship with Austria-Hungary transformed overnight. Not because the economic arrangement had changed, the trade ties remained and were profitable for both parties, but because the empire revealed that it would never actually allow Serbian nationalism to become politically meaningful. Serbia's reaction to this was extraordinary, and to understand why, I need to explain a bit about how small states usually behave in international politics. Political scientists use the term small state to describe countries with limited territory, population, resources, and military power, and typically, small states survive by being cautious. They try to avoid direct confrontation with great powers, they align themselves with larger protectors, and they define success through stability rather than ambition. Their whole diplomatic strategy is defensive, because you don't want to provoke anyone bigger than you. But Serbia was doing the opposite. Even as a small state, it refused to accept its marginalized status. It projected power far beyond its borders, challenging empires that dwarfed it, and it imagined itself as the unifier of all the Southern Slavic peoples. It's like watching someone bet their entire life savings on a single hand of poker. Not because the odds are good, but because winning that hand is the only future that they're willing to accept. Serbia had decided that its political identity, its vision of what it wanted to become, mattered more than the safe play. And that's where our story is going to take a rather philosophical turn. As I was writing the script of this video, I realized that if we really wish to understand why this conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary became so intractable, we were going to need to step outside of economics and military strategy. We were going to need to look at the bigger picture, and that bigger picture requires us to start by asking a really ambitious question. What actually is politics at its most fundamental level? For that, I would like to turn our attention towards the German political philosopher Carl Schmitt. Now, I need to be extremely direct about who Schmitt was and why we are using his philosophical ideas, because it's not enough to just say that he was some controversial figure. He was an actual National Socialist, and more than that, he became the official legal theorist for the Third Reich. He developed his ideas to provide an intellectual justification for authoritarian dictatorship. His political conclusions were dangerous, and I'm very aware that including him in this video is risky. And I'm not alone in this. Despite his toxic politics, Schmitt's ideas have been engaged with extremely critically by some of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. Hannah Arendt grappled with his theories of sovereignty. Jürgen Habermas debated his critique of liberalism. Jacques Derrida, Slavoj Žižek, Leo Strauss, they all wrestled with his concepts not because they agreed with his conclusions, but because he identified real problems in how we think about politics. And as I began to study negative identity, this idea that we define ourselves through opposition, I kept running into Schmitt, because he developed one of the most foundational political frameworks for understanding exactly how this process works. Or you can think about it this way. If you want to understand how a bank's security system works, sometimes the best person to ask is a former bank robber. Not because we trust their motives, but because they studied the vulnerabilities of the bank with intense focus. Schmitt examined liberal political systems the way a safecracker studies a lock. So what exactly did Schmitt see? He saw that political conflicts don't dissolve through trade or negotiation because he observed they're not about interests. They're instead about existence. Now that's very abstract, so let me instead give you an example to make this concrete. Imagine two neighboring communities with a river between them. One community believes their river should be shared. Anyone can fish and anyone can use it, while the other community believes the river belongs to whoever controls the land around it. So he wants private property and private rights. Now we can negotiate fishing quotas, we can trade access for some sort of payment, but we can't really compromise on the fundamental question at play here. Does the river belong to everyone or someone? Because we're not just dealing with two different competing interests, they are fundamentally incompatible ways of organizing life itself. One vision and one community has to win, or both communities have to accept that they can't coexist under the same system. And this is what Schmitt called the friend-enemy distinction. It's key to understanding what I labeled negative identity at the start of this video. In essence, we define ourselves as much by what we oppose as by what we believe in. For Schmitt, politics begins with this single, decisive distinction. Who is your friend and who is your enemy? The enemy, he wrote, is the other, the stranger, whose very way of existing makes coexistence impossible. An enemy doesn't have to be morally evil or economically harmful. You may even profit by trading with them, as Austria-Hungary did with Serbia, and vice versa. But the enemy represents a political identity that cannot exist alongside yours. It's not really out of any hatred, but just because of a fundamental incompatibility. After 1908, this is what Serbia became to Austria-Hungary, and what Austria-Hungary became to Serbia. Serbian nationalism and Habsburg multinationalism were incompatible visions of how the future political order of Europe should be organized. Serbia wanted to unite the Southern Slavic people under their own leadership, while Austria-Hungary needed to prevent nationalist movements from fragmenting its own multinational structure. Now, we do have the benefit of hindsight, but it's very unlikely that some sort of compromise was possible here. There was no amount of economic integration or administrative efficiency that could resolve what was a political conflict that required a political answer. A decision about who would exist and who wouldn't, and what future political order would dominate Europe. But Austria-Hungary had spent much of its existence avoiding exactly this kind of decision. The empire's whole logic was built precisely on not choosing between competing national claims. Its legitimacy came from representing all of its peoples equally through dynastic authority. Making Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction explicit and saying that these people belong and those other people threatened us, well, it risked destroying what the empire was in its essence. So instead, Austria-Hungary tried to manage the problem. There would be more surveillance of Serbian nationalists within Habsburg territories, more pressure on Belgrade diplomatically, and more economic leverage. The empire kept trying to solve what was a political problem through non-political means. And Serbia, meanwhile, became even more purely political. After the 1908 annexation, Serbian military intelligence developed connections to the Black Hand and other nationalist organizations in Habsburg territories. Now, historians still debate how directly the Serbian government controlled any of these networks. Were they official policy or rogue elements within the military? For this video today, it actually isn't relevant at all for us. From Vienna's perspective, the distinctions simply didn't matter. What matters was that subversion was flowing from Serbian territory into theirs, and Belgrade either couldn't or wouldn't stop it. Serbia had become exactly what Schmitt described, a political entity whose very existence threatened the empire's form of life existentially. When Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, he wasn't just assassinating one man, but he was forcing the decision that Austria-Hungary had avoided for decades. Either the empire would finally make the friend-enemy distinction explicit and act decisively against Serbian nationalism, or it would reveal itself as politically incapable of self-defense. And Austria-Hungary's response came in the form of an ultimatum. It was a list of 10 demands delivered to Belgrade on July 23rd. Some of the points were more reasonable. Serbia would suppress anti-Austrian propaganda and dissolve its nationalist organizations. But there was one demand that was intentionally designed to be unacceptable. Austria-Hungary wanted to send its own officials into Serbia to investigate the assassination and root out the conspiracy themselves, which meant giving foreign police the freedom to operate on Serbian soil, a direct violation of sovereignty for any independent state. This ultimatum created a truly fascinating strategic moment. Political scientist Dejan Marolov helps us understand it clearly. He argues that after 1908, Serbia and Austria-Hungary were trapped in a prisoner's dilemma, a situation where both sides believed that war was inevitable, even if neither wanted it immediately. But what does this actually mean? Well, imagine that you and me are standing in a dark room. Each of us is convinced that the other person is reaching for a weapon. Now, if you shoot me first, you may survive. If you wait, you may die, and the same principle goes for me. The only way to stay safe is to act first, and that very logic guarantees violence. Serbia feared that compromise would mean their subjugation to a bigger power. Austria-Hungary feared that any hesitation would mean their collapse. Each side's fear made conflict not just likely, but actually rational. Let's dive into this with a little bit more detail. Serbia, as a small power, faced 4 possible responses to Austria-Hungary's ultimatum. It could fully accept, which meant surrendering its own sovereignty, but avoiding war. It could reject it, defending its dignity but guaranteeing a conflict. It could also pretend to accept the ultimatum while secretly preparing for war, or it could stall for time and mediation, hoping that Russia and other great powers would intervene to support it. Marolov shows that Serbia chose a calculated blend of the last two. It accepted almost every demand, enough to appear reasonable to the world, but rejected the crucial point. It would not allow the Austrian investigators on Serbian soil. It was deliberate political theater. It was trying to preserve its sovereignty while buying time to mobilize. And this is a great example of how Serbia behaved like a small state that refused to think small, turning limited power into serious strategic leverage. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, made its own decision by declaring war on Serbia on July 28th. But in doing so, the empire discovered something pretty devastating. It actually couldn't really make Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction work in practice. To see what I mean, think about what the empire was actually asking its soldiers to do. It needed southern Slavs living within Habsburg territories, such as Croats, Bosnians, and Slovenes, to fight against the idea of Southern Slavic nationalism. And this would only become more widespread as the war expanded. Let's take, for example, when Italy entered on the Allied side, and the empire found itself asking ethnic Italians in its armies to fight against their fellow Italians too, and on and on. It was asking people to suppress the very identity that they shared with the enemy. The empire had built itself on the idea that these contradictions didn't matter, that dynastic loyalty and institutional belonging could override some sort of primalistic national identity. But when crisis came, when it needed its people to answer the question, who are we fighting for, the empire discovered that it had never developed a political identity strong enough to compete with the nationalism of its time. To be clear, the institutional loyalty to the crown was strong. Habsburg soldiers kept fighting with discipline and courage through some of the worst conditions of the war. The empire didn't collapse from cowardice or a lack of will. But as casualties mounted, as hundreds of thousands died and citizens starved, a question spread, perhaps most of all back home, far away from the front, that no amount of bravery could answer. What exactly is it that we are fighting for? The Germans were fighting for Germany, the Serbs were fighting for Southern Slavs, the Italians were fighting for Italia Redenta, but what were the Habsburg soldiers dying for? Was it a dynasty? An administrative system? The preservation of multinational coexistence? Or was it the empire, which had spent centuries avoiding these types of political questions and had no answer? In the end, that silence was louder than any declaration of war. And so at this point in the video, we need to understand why Austria-Hungary couldn't answer that question. To do this, I would like to dig deeper into what Carl Schmitt actually thought about politics and why he believed systems like Austria-Hungary, built on administration rather than political identity, were fundamentally vulnerable. So let's take a step back and understand the context. Schmitt wrote his most famous work, The Concept of the Political, in 1927, which was in Weimar Germany, a liberal parliamentary democracy that he perceived was failing. And there were reasons why he thought this. There was political violence in the streets, endless coalition governments which were collapsing, extremist parties which were gaining strength. The whole system seemed paralyzed, unable to make decisions, and unable to defend itself at crucial moments. Schmitt was trying to understand why this was happening the way it was. Why did liberal systems seem so weak in times of crisis? His answer was radical. To him, liberalism fundamentally misunderstands what politics actually is, which, to be fair, is exactly what we might expect to hear from a man who never met a liberal institution he didn't want to put under a temporary exception and dissolve. But we can take his point nonetheless. From the lens that Schmitt developed, politics isn't about shared values or rational discussion, but it's about something he called intensity. When does a disagreement become something more than just a disagreement? Well, when it reaches the point when people are willing to fight and die for it. When it becomes about the survival of a community's way of life, well, at that point, Schmitt concluded, it is in the realm of the political. It's not just that something is merely important, but it has to demand collective sacrifice. Liberal systems, Schmitt argued, try to deny this reality. They believe that every conflict can be resolved through discussion and compromise, and that rational debate can replace existential decisions. And because of this, they essentially turn politics into economics and law and administration, anything but what it actually is. And so when the moment of crisis comes, and when questions arise that can't just be negotiated away, these systems discover that they've lost the capacity to make actual political decisions. They dissolve not because they're necessarily weak, but because they never actually develop the ability to answer the most fundamental question: what are we willing to fight for? And this brings us to Schmitt's most famous and controversial formulation: sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Now that kind of sounds like philosophical nonsense, but let me explain what it means. Political authority, Schmitt argued, ultimately comes from the capacity to decide when normal rules no longer apply, when a crisis requires action beyond legal procedure, when someone has to stand up and declare that this is a friend, this is an enemy, and this is what we're going to defend. So why did I just give you a lecture on the political philosophy of a Nazi jurist who I personally disagree a lot with? Well, because he has an important theoretical point here that helps us diagnose what may have been wrong with Austria-Hungary. Now, Austria-Hungary was not a liberal democracy. It was a constitutional monarchy with very limited parliamentary power. But Schmitt's critique isn't really about any specific regime type. It's about any political system that tries to avoid making the friend-enemy distinction. Whether you're a liberal democracy trying to resolve everything through discussion or a dynastic empire trying to resolve everything through administration, the end result is the same. Here was a political entity that tried to exist without really being political at all. An empire that had spent centuries avoiding a question that was unavoidable. Who belongs to our political community and who threatens it? For centuries, the Habsburg Empire had a crucial advantage. Its enemies were strong and they were external. The Ottoman Empire threatened Christian Europe. Napoleon's rise threatened the old monarchical order. Prussia challenged Habsburg dominance in German affairs. These were clear friend-enemy distinctions. Everyone within the empire, be it Germans or Hungarians, Czechs and South Slavs, could unite against the Turk or against Prussians and revolutionary France because the threat came from the outside. The empire knew what it opposed, and that opposition created internal cohesion. I'm not saying it was the only reason, but it was a part of it. After 1866, something had fundamentally changed. Austria-Hungary's defeat by Prussia at Königsgrätz didn't just end Habsburg leadership in German affairs, it instead marked the moment when the empire's existential threats stopped being external and became internal. Serbian nationalism, Czech nationalism, Italian irredentism, these were not foreign armies that you could march against. These were movements within the empire's own borders, among people who were supposed to be Habsburg subjects. And that's where Schmitt's framework reveals the empire's impossible dilemma. How do you make the friend-enemy distinction when the enemy is part of your own political community? To fight Serbian nationalism meant declaring South Slavs within your empire as enemies, but they were your subjects. To suppress Czech aspirations meant alienating the Czechs, but they were Habsburg citizens. You can check out my last video if you want to understand this in more detail, but this is why the Compromise of 1867 was so revealing. It wasn't just an administrative reform, it was a political decision that chose winners and losers. Germans and Hungarians became the dominant partners, and everyone else remained subordinate. The empire had made a friend-enemy distinction, but it just couldn't admit it had actually done so, which in all honesty was maybe worse. So with this lens, we perhaps see better why Austria-Hungary was vulnerable in principle. It was a state that tried to exist without ever deciding who truly belonged in its own political community. But knowing why it was politically fragile doesn't yet explain how that fragility actually unfolded inside the empire, how loyalty turned to disillusionment, or how neighbors become enemies. For that, I would now like to turn to the historian Arnold Toynbee, whose work on the collapse of civilizations offers a pretty good complement to our own ideas that we've developed so far. Where Schmitt focuses on political boundaries between friend and enemy, Toynbee studies how multinational empires manage diversity. The question is basically this: how do you transform potential enemies to your empire into loyal subjects? And he identifies a recurring pattern that he calls the internal proletariat. Empires, Toynbee observed, often integrate minority populations by educating their elites and drawing them into imperial administration. At first, these elites believe in the system. They see opportunity, advancement, and legitimacy in serving the empire. But over time, they realize they've been admitted into a structure that will never fully accept them as equals. They possess the skills of the ruling class but remain outsiders to its power, and eventually they turn from loyal servants into disillusioned reformers, and finally into leaders of opposition movements. And in this way, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was creating its own internal enemies. You educate someone, give them skills and ambitions, but then block them from real power. And if you're a student of history, you'll know that that's how you manufacture a revolutionary. But why do some elites stay loyal while others turn against the empire? What determines whether educated minorities will pull toward the center or away from it? This is where another political scientist called Anthony Stevens Arroyo extends Toynbee's insight for us in a way that connects directly back to Schmitt. He distinguishes between two kinds of nationalism that emerge within empires. Centripetal nationalism, he says, pulls towards the center. It happens when people see advantage in belonging to a larger political community. When membership brings prosperity, protection, and opportunity, national identity will flow inward. Or in Schmitt's terms, these groups see themselves as friends within the political order, and they share in its form of existence. Centrifugal nationalism pulls away from the center. It happens when membership brings humiliation, subordination, and blocked advancement. When the empire keeps you as a second-class citizen despite your education and abilities, nationalism begins to flow outward towards separation. Groups within the community begin to see it as not their own, as Schmitt's other, an alien form of existence that denies their rights. And perhaps what Austria-Hungary never understood was that after 1867, it was systematically converting centripetal nationalism into centrifugal nationalism. The empire was creating its own internal opposition through the very structure it claimed held everyone together. Let's make this more concrete and take Bohemia as an example. Did the Czech national awakening really begin from peasants in revolt? No, not really. It was from imperial insiders. These were bureaucrats, teachers, and scholars who had risen through Habsburg institutions. These were people who had learned to think in imperial terms, but gradually realized the system would never treat them as completely equal. Nationalism in this sense wasn't born against the empire, it was educated by it. Or let's take the Hungarians who pursued aggressive Magyarization, forcing the Hungarian language and culture on other nationalities in their side of the kingdom. By 1910, 96% of civil servants in Hungary had Hungarian as their mother tongue. This was centrifugal nationalism in action. The message was clear: you can advance within the system only by ceasing to be who you are. So now let's go back to Schmitt's critique of liberalism to connect everything together and discuss the empire's collapse. Austria-Hungary kept trying to solve this fundamentally political problem through an administrative lens. There would be more reforms, more commissions studying federalization, more economic development in peripheral regions. The empire kept treating everything as an engineering problem, adjusting the mechanisms and fine-tuning the balance. But that was not the real question at all. It was political in its very nature. Who actually are we, and why do these people belong in our community? But to give an answer wouldn't be possible because it would just destroy the empire itself. To say yes, the Czechs and South Slavs fully belong meant transforming into a federal system that would eliminate the German and Hungarian dominance. But to instead say, no, there are subjects and not our partners, meant acknowledging the empire was a German and Hungarian dominated structure which violated its own legitimizing mythology. So where exactly do we find ourselves with all of these contradictions? Because the compromise, if we want to call it that, didn't really address any of them at all. Going back to Marlov's analysis, it becomes clear that when war finally came in 1914, neither empire nor kingdom was actually insecure. Austria-Hungary had a vast military, a German alliance, and its territorial integrity was intact. Serbia had Russian backing, fresh victories from the Balkan Wars, and a battle-tested army. In the traditional classic security dilemma, one side arms itself for defense, and the other interprets it as aggression and arms in response, which creates a spiral of fear and misunderstanding that leads to a war neither side actually wanted. But in our case here, we have something different. Both sides felt secure enough to risk everything. The war happened not because they were threatened, but because they finally felt strong enough to pursue what they had always wanted. Austria-Hungary to eliminate the Serbian threat permanently, and Serbia to position itself for South Slav liberation. Sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when nations feel vulnerable, it's when they feel invincible. And that's the real lesson here. Once both powers define their survival around mutually exclusive identities, strength itself became the trigger. The conflict was no longer about territory or deterrence, but it was about whose vision of political existence would prevail. Austria-Hungary fought to preserve a world where nations could coexist under an imperial roof, while Serbia fought to create one where nations ruled themselves. Both were defending a separate worldview and set of ideas of what order was. It wasn't just borders.
So let's now return this video to where it all started. What makes you, you, and how do any of us actually define ourselves? What Schmitt understood, despite his terrible politics, was that identity isn't just about what unites us. It's equally about what we oppose. But here's the part of our story that actually reveals something that goes beyond the framework that Schmitt developed. Opposition itself can become a trap. Yes, the friend-enemy distinction creates political intensity, gives communities the will to survive crisis. But the thing is that enemies don't last forever. They collapse or transform or simply stop mattering. And if your entire identity was built on opposition, then their absence doesn't free you, it just empties you. The communities that endure aren't just the ones that know who they oppose. They're the ones that can answer a harder question. What do we love enough to build and not just to defend? What would we create even if no one threatened us? So maybe the real political question that comes out of all of this isn't friend versus enemy at all. It's whether you're defined by what you're running from or what you're running towards.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. I just want to take a moment, as I do at the end of each video, to say how incredibly grateful I am for your amazing support. I try my best to read all of your comments, and they often make my mornings and my days. I also wanted to share something exciting. In my spare time, I've been developing a video game called The Infanterist. It's completely free to play and browser-based, with the planned release date being October 26th. If you'd like to learn more about that, stay updated, or just connect with our growing community, you can always join us on Discord using the link below. We play video games with the community, chat, suggest video ideas, and to be honest, it's just awesome to meet with you and talk with you directly as well. So once again, thank you for watching, and as always, stay curious about history.